People really need to know about melatonin, and they don't know. They have half truths. There are thousands of published articles on melatonin. That's why I can't understand why melatonin isn't getting truly the traction that it needs to. I'm going to cover a lot of different ground here. What is melatonin? The functions of melatonin? How do we create healthy melatonin levels in the body naturally? How do we do it through nutrition and lifestyle? Think of melatonin as the Swiss Army knife of functions. There are 6 main functions that I see for melatonin. When we look at the ability of the body to produce melatonin, it is peaking during childhood. We start to see that melatonin starts to decline through puberty. By the time we get to our mid-50s, we start to see negligible amounts of melatonin produced by the pineal gland. Some people say, how many tart cherries do I have to give me a basic dose of melatonin? That would take 2,718 fresh cherries in order to get 0.3 milligrams of melatonin. I never want to portray that health is just one thing, but I do think melatonin is really essential.
Most people think of melatonin strictly as a sleep hormone. Explain why that's only the tip of the iceberg.
It's so much more than a sleep hormone. In fact, I don't even know if I would call it a sleep hormone. It is a circadian hormone with the byproduct of sleep. So I think because people don't understand the fuller context of what melatonin is about and how it works, like we just reduce it to something like, oh, it's for sleep. But it's a whole lot more than that. And that's what we're going to talk about.
All right, well, let's have you take the floor here and give a broad overview.
Okay. Well, first, I want to say I'm so excited to talk about this. I was even thinking about it last night. Every chance I get to talk about melatonin, I don't know why, but I feel like it is very fulfilling because I feel that people really need to know about melatonin, and they don't know. They have half truths. So, just to set the stage just a little bit for why am I talking with you about melatonin? So, over the past years, I have been doing scientific research into melatonin. I've been interviewing dozens of different experts in melatonin who have dedicated, in some cases, their lives to melatonin research, like Dr. Russell Ryder, like Dr. Tunchen Tan, Dr. Cardinelli in South America. I mean, there are so many people that have actually been publishing on melatonin that I wanted to check what I knew about melatonin versus what they were researching and publishing on. So there's also a review article that I published with the science medical team at Symphony Natural Health. We published that in Nutrients in 2022. It's been a very popular paper. It's been read, I think it's been over 80,000 different people have looked at the paper. It's really had a lot of traction. So I just wanted to establish why am I talking with you about melatonin? So it really does come from my background in nutrition science. So let's dive in. I'm going to cover a lot of different ground here in terms of what is melatonin, what are the functions of melatonin, even the ones that we don't know about, but we should know about. And then I'm going to talk about how do we create healthy melatonin levels in the body naturally? How do we do it through nutrition and lifestyle? I'm going to talk about supplementation. And in full disclosure, I am the Chief Science Officer at Symphony Natural Health, which has a plant-based melatonin. So I'm going to talk about the different formats of melatonin because there are many, from gummies to lozenges, and people are doing all kinds of things with melatonin. So if you know, you know. All right. So as I mentioned, my disclosures, this is educational. So there are going to be some contraindications for melatonin, and we're going to talk about those too. All right. So I guess the biggest thing, so I have one of my Google alerts set to just the term melatonin, and every day I am getting alerts on what is being said out there in the ethers on melatonin. And sometimes it's really good, and other times it's like, don't take melatonin. It causes all of these issues. And I think that melatonin really hit the media stage during the pandemic, like when people were trying to figure out immune protocols. Obviously, we would know about vitamin C, zinc, just a variety of different vitamins and minerals. But then melatonin started to come into those protocols. So I think that When we look at how people had dysregulated circadian rhythms because they were at home, they were out of their norm, they were starting to take melatonin. So I think that there's just been a groundswell about melatonin with respect to its use. And, it's kind of like the old adage, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So people just started thinking, oh, I'll just take melatonin. I can't sleep well. They're not looking at the root cause. So, being that I am in the space of functional medicine, we always ask why. Why is somebody not sleeping well? It may or may not be melatonin. Melatonin is connected to other things. But anyway, I don't know if you've seen this as well, Jesse, that whether it's, oh, there's people overdosing or, these supplements are problematic or it's a hormone or if you take it, your body's going to stop making it. We'll address that later on. But that's probably one of the biggest questions I get. And then there's the whole thing of like the paradoxical effect. Does it cause nightmares, making people groggy in the morning? We're going to talk about all of that. So that gets more into the nuance of dosing, format, timing of all things. So, kind of interesting because, again, in addition to monitoring the media, I also monitor the science of melatonin. So, there are thousands of published articles on melatonin, literally thousands. Like, that's why I can't understand why melatonin isn't getting truly the traction that it needs to because there is so much research that has been published. So for people listening where they're thinking, well, how does she know this? You go to pubmed.com or .gov and basically just type in melatonin. You will see all of the different articles, clinical trials, animal studies, review articles. Just do the search yourself. Don't take my word for it. Again, there are thousands upon thousands of articles. This is one. I think the reason why melatonin has spilled over into the longevity space and why biohackers are really interested in it is because it does connect to many different mechanisms. Now, I don't think I would call it the fountain of youth, but I do think that melatonin is really important for helping with processes related to aging. And by the time I'm done with talking about it, I think everybody listening will understand why. Again, I don't see any one agent as like the shiny object. I never want to portray that health is just one thing, but I do think melatonin is really essential. All right, so first let's start by talking about, well, what is melatonin? I think it's kind of interesting when we think about the discovery of melatonin because it was discovered by a dermatologist, actually. It's kind of interesting. The dermatologist was looking into skin lightening agents and came across some early literature in the early 1900s related to the pineal gland and frogs and how, the pineal gland put into a vat of frogs caused some skin changes and coloring changes in the frogs. So Dr. Aaron Lerner was thinking, well, this is kind of interesting with this pineal gland. What is it producing? And identified that there is this molecule, which if you look off to the top left there, you see this molecule. Its chemical name is N-acetyl 5-methoxytryptamine. Sometimes people think, oh, tryptamine, because that's connected to kind of the whole thing of psychedelics and the metabolism of certain compounds. But melatonin is not a psychedelic. But aside from that, the way that it was coined from an actual, like the name of it, melatonin, is related to this dermatologist, which thought it was about the skin. And many times we see this in science where something is discovered early on, and then after that, we soon come to see that, oh, wow, there are so many other functions of that molecule. It's not just skin. He called it tonin, so mela because of the skin, tonin because the structure was related to serotonin. So if you look at kind of, and you're going to see this as I go through the presentation, but tryptophan is an amino acid that converts to serotonin. Serotonin converts to melatonin. So if you have an issue with any part of that conversion, you'll have lower melatonin. So if you are using a lot of serotonin or converting a lot to serotonin and then using it, There could be an issue with you making enough melatonin, or do you have the precursor? Do you have enough tryptophan? So, separately from all of that, Jesse, what's really interesting is in the plant science research, there's a whole other study about melatonin. Melatonin in plants, well, first of all, melatonin is found in plants, it's found in animals, but specifically in plants, what we see is that it's used as a growth factor. So, what you see very interestingly is that melatonin sometimes is sprayed on plants to help them grow better. You could see even here this picture of broccoli. So, the treated broccoli with melatonin looks a bit more vibrant versus the untreated. And you also get certain phytochemicals that are important for health. So, specifically here, it translates into more of the compounds that we know of as glucosinolates. And glucosinolates are just great compounds for many different things, one of which is even metabolic detoxification. So, melatonin is ancient, it's nothing new. It exists everywhere, truly everywhere. And in fact, it more or less evolved with the mitochondria. And I'll get into that a little bit more. So I would consider it, it's a natural molecule. It is in plants, it's in us, it's in most of our body compartments. And again, wasn't discovered until 1958. And even if you look at the science of the pineal gland, we didn't even start to look into pineal gland science until about the 1960s. So if you look at Dr. Russell Ryder's research, he started looking into melatonin as a potential hibernation agent for astronauts. Like melatonin has been everywhere, but it didn't seem to play a role in that capacity, in that function. And so you start to see that a lot of different scientists took it in different directions. And I would say it's still kind of being teased out as far as all of the different mechanisms. So that's what I love about it. It's like it's somewhat complex, and it's just doing so many different things. So I'm hoping that everybody's hearing that it's more than a hormone. It's not like a classical hormone in the way of like estrogen or testosterone or even cortisol. There's no like feedback loop with the pineal gland per se, right? So like it's more than a hormone, and it doesn't operate like a classic hormone. It does have hormone properties, and it's fair to say that it is derived from, well, it's, if you think about it, it's actually derived from a neurotransmitter, serotonin. So I would say it's more accurately a neurohormone at best. But as you can see here in this publication, talking about melatonin is perhaps best defined as both a pineal hormone and a bioactive amine with cellular targets near its site of synthesis in some tissues. Now, one of the areas that I've lectured a lot on is women's health. And what you find is that the eggs, so if you think of the ovaries and the eggs, the oocytes, what you see is that they have one of the highest concentrations of mitochondria in the whole body. And melatonin is found wherever there's mitochondria. So it's thought that melatonin plays a role in the mitochondrial aspects of ovarian aging. So again, kind of thinking about longevity, aging, why is there such interest there? All right, I thought this was a very interesting graphic from an article looking at all the many genetic targets of melatonin. This again just shows that there's complexity, that we're not just hitting on one pathway with one molecule. There is what is referred to as a pleiotropic effect. Pleiotropic just means that there's kind of this ripple through effect, that there are many different genetic signatures and functions ultimately as a result of this interaction with, in this case, what we're talking about, melatonin. All right, so in our bodies, where is it found? It's found in a lot of different places. We can almost say, where is it not found? It's not found typically in dead tissue like nails and hair, but it is widespread throughout the body. And the reason why it is widespread is because melatonin has an interesting chemical structure. It is both water soluble and it's fat soluble. So it can traverse through many different body tissues. So it can be in the brain, which is really fatty. It can be in the eye, which is kind of aqueous. It can be in the skin, which is both liquid and fat at the same time, depending on where it's at. Liver, kidney, thyroid, thymus, skeletal muscle, reproductive system. Just again, think wherever there are mitochondria, wherever there are those powerhouses generating energy, you will find melatonin. And we're going to talk about mitochondrial melatonin versus pineal melatonin because there is a difference between the production. It's present in body fluids. So when people go to measure their melatonin, typically they give either a saliva sample or a urine sample, and that will tell you the output as some kind of metabolite of melatonin. So in the urine, typically this is a sulfur compound that is measured. And so at the end, usually people say, well, Deanna, how do I know if I have enough melatonin, that my body's making enough? Well, if you really wanted to quantify it, and again, there are a lot of issues with quantification because so much can change depending on the circumstances under which you're taking that sample, but we'll get into that a little bit more. But one of the ways is urine. With some of the researchers that I interviewed, now, again, they're like academic researchers, they're not clinicians. Many times what they're looking at is saliva. And so they're looking at saliva as it gets dim outside and you start to see the curve upwards of melatonin. And then even, but it really does peak in the middle of the night. So it's hard to capture that melatonin level, right? So that's why either you're doing the curve going up, so up until bedtime, or you're catching it in the morning in first morning urine. But it's also found in breast milk. So for women who are nursing, this is really interesting, right? Because children, when they're born, because their gut microbiome is just forming, their brain is forming, they're just kind of getting up to speed in many different systems. The maternal melatonin can potentially help. And we see this in animal studies, not so much in clinical trials because it would be kind of cumbersome to test that. But if a child is being nursed with breast milk from the evening, you can imagine that the mother would have melatonin in her breast milk to impart to the child, which may or may not help in the circadian signaling and ultimately the sleep of that infant. So, you have to ask the question, do children have, or do babies more accurately have colic? Because there's a dysregulation of that circadian patterning, right? So melatonin may play a role there because there's a little bit of a lag when a baby is first born until, again, their gut, their brain, everything is kind of syncing up, which many parents know because the sleep cycles are completely, they're not getting sleep, the baby's not getting sleep. Well, maybe melatonin is connected to that. So the other thing that does make melatonin a classic hormone in the way of how hormones have been defined is that cells have receptors for melatonin. And so because cells have receptors for melatonin, that means that there can also be genetic variability in how we all receive melatonin. I'm going to get into that a little bit later, but I want you to remember that there is genetic variability on people's chronotype, circadian rhythm, and ability to receive the signal of melatonin at the cellular level. So we're going to get into that because that may, again, determine why some people respond really well to melatonin and other people don't. Is there a genetic link? But for now, I want you just to think of basically if you were to look at this human body and say, okay, if you're a woman, you've got ovaries, you're going to have a high concentration of melatonin in those ovaries. A man with testes, you're going to have high concentration in sperm. But for the most part, the two main organs that are making melatonin it would be the pineal gland, which is in the brain, a very small gland right in the middle of the head, which we're going to get into, but basically in the middle of the night, that is what is making melatonin and then it's being sent out systemically to get all of the different clock genes and all of the different cells to synchronize. It's a beautiful way to think about, like, the body is, like, trying to find its rhythm with nature. It's like a symphony, right? So if you don't have proper melatonin, it's harder to sync up all of the body organs. That's why if you look at melatonin being so connected to so many body systems, it's like we are primed to be in sync with nature's rhythm, which is why daylight saving time screws us up, right? Like that 1 hour, even though it's 1 hour, you could say, what's the big deal? No, it's a really big deal. And after that time shift, we do see changes in things like our cardiovascular parameters. We see greater car accidents on that Monday morning right after that time change. Time is a big deal. And the way that I think about all of health, now that I've been steeped in this chronobiology for some time, is everything follows time. So when we try to buck the system of time, whether through shift work or jet lag, we really do feel the repercussions of that. And we start to see different risks for certain diseases start to crop up. The other organ that makes a lot of melatonin is the gut. So the gut actually makes much more melatonin than the pineal gland, but it serves a different purpose and seems to be used more locally.
Well, let me jump in actually with a quick question.
Yeah.
You've made it clear that melatonin is found throughout the body, primarily made in the pineal gland in the stomach. How much of that, and you did when you talked about the melatonin made in the gut, said that it's primarily for that area, but I'm just curious how much of it moves around throughout the body and engages from those two primary sites throughout the rest of the body.
Great question. Pineal gland, it's going throughout the entire body. That is, typically when we think of a hormone, it's produced by a gland and then it travels somewhere else to make some action. So the pineal melatonin is in small amounts, but it has a systemic effect. Gut melatonin, it has a different, it's produced in response to meals, so not in response to light and darkness in the same way that the pineal gland is producing melatonin. And it seems to have a more local effect. There might be some that travels systemically, but that it's for the most part, what you see in the literature is that it has a more localized effect. It's kind of like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in the gut stays in the gut, more or less. But the gut is huge. And the gut is strongly neuroendocrine, right? The gut is producing neurotransmitters. Those neurotransmitters don't go through the body and cross the blood-brain barrier per se, right? Like we see that many times these different compounds, they are having a more localized effect. But again, not to say that there can't be some traveling, but for the most part, based on what I have queried of different researchers, is that it's having a more local effect in the gut.
Okay, so the melatonin made in the brain, no problem crossing the blood-brain barrier. And even though it's less made within the pineal gland, it's still spread out from there to the rest of the body.
Correct. Yeah, it does. It goes, and I'm going to show you a diagram. I think it'll become clearer as we go. I've got lots of graphics in here because I feel like in order to really understand all these pathways, it just helps to see it. So we'll get to a nice graphic that'll explain what you just asked about, and we can go into any more clarifying questions there.
Let me just ask one more thing while it's top of mind. The fact that, again, I'm just trying to piece together these two different areas that are making melatonin. Is the melatonin the exact same? That's made in the two primary areas?
It is. Yep.
Okay.
Melatonin is melatonin is melatonin. Melatonin from a plant, it looks the same as the melatonin in our bodies. So if it is called melatonin, there isn't any difference there. Now, keep in mind that the skin also makes melatonin because it's got mitochondria. So if you go outside, there is also kind of the amplification of the mitochondria to then produce melatonin. But again, that's going to have a more local effect. The skin again is vast, like the gut. And so there are other functions of melatonin that are being harnessed by that localized production, right? So the pineal gland function of melatonin is very specific. It's to synchronize body clocks to circadian rhythm. That's not necessarily the same function that we see with the gut derived melatonin or the skin derived melatonin, because that's produced at different times of the day and through different signals.
Perfect. I'll have you continue.
All right. I like the questions though, because it helps us to. I sometimes just take things for granted that people understand certain things. There are many different facets to these different activities. So, if we were to think about the functions of melatonin, again, when people just say, "Oh, melatonin's a hormone," back to your first question, it's so much more, right? It plays a role in regulating body temperature. So when we start to get a little bit chilled at night, kind of like that feeling of like, "Oh, let me go change into my pajamas." I'm getting kind of that sleepy feel. You can thank melatonin for that. The sleep wake cycle, the 24-hour light dark cycle, is related to melatonin, of course. Hormones in general, if you change up one hormone, especially cortisol, you may change up melatonin. And melatonin and cortisol are like a seesaw. Cortisol is the hormone of the morning, melatonin is the hormone of the night. So if you're changing your nightly melatonin, you could be changing the morning cortisol. If you're stressed out and your cortisol curve is off, you could be changing up your melatonin. So we'll talk a little bit more about the connection with stress and melatonin. Other things like blood pressure, cell proliferation, immune system. Definitely, you find melatonin throughout the immune system. So for some people, that might be something to think about because there can be a bit of immune stimulation that can occur from taking melatonin because there's kind of this groundswell or upregulatory effect of the immune system. The gut microbiome, by the way, the gut microbiome has its own circadian rhythm. Like we are rhythm upon rhythm, right? The gut microbiome has a rhythm. We have different body tissues with their rhythms. But the gut microbiome, which is vast, has a circadian rhythm to it. And one of the things that we're going to get into in this particular dialogue is we're going to talk about how is it helping us to clear the brain of metabolites at night? This is a newer function that many people don't know about. So I'm going to spend more time on that. And I put in some slides here to take people through that because that is an area that, again, it's kind of like, what? That's a new kind of a new wrinkle in everything. So if you look at the literature, and there's a great research site that I will share at the end of this, it's phytomelatonin.org. But people can go on there and look at how there are associations between melatonin and certain types of conditions. And in fact, we even discuss this a bit more in the article that we published in Nutrients in 2022. This is kind of how the melatonin as a hormone works. So everything starts with the eyes. We perceive light and dark through the eyes. That's a key feature for us to be thinking about as we go further because the subject of blue light blocking glasses is going to come up, right? So let's imagine, we've got our eyes and we're outside, we're seeing the sunlight. We're inhibiting any kind of melatonin production. So through the day, when our cortisol is kind of got center stage, we are flatlined on melatonin. So that's why you wouldn't be measuring melatonin during the day because you wouldn't see anything because the pineal gland is producing melatonin in response to darkness. So once we have darkness and the absence of blue light, hopefully, what we see with the certain cells in the retina, the back of the eye here, that is then going to transmit a signal to a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is a cluster of 10 to 20,000 neurons. That will ultimately send a signal to the pineal gland saying, okay, we're ready for melatonin. So everything starts with the eye perceiving either light or darkness. That's really pivotal for this conversation, and that only applies to that pineal gland melatonin.
That's what I was going to ask. What about gut melatonin and skin melatonin? Any impact by light and dark?
Well, you'll see with the skin that there can be some local production of melatonin by mitochondria in the skin in response to full spectrum light. But again, that's more of a localized effect of melatonin. It's not like this pineal melatonin that's syncing up the circadian clocks within the different body systems. So the one that would respond to light and circadian rhythm is the one that is the pineal gland generated. As it starts to get dim outside, our pineal gland starts to get the message through the eyes to start to produce more melatonin. So that's why we have what's called dim light melatonin onset. DLMO, dim light melatonin onset. And you want that dim light at night, but unfortunately, people are not bathing their eyes in dim light at night. They're going to the grocery store to go shopping under artificial fluorescent lights. They're going to the gym to work out under fluorescent lights. They're going to sporting events under fluorescent lights. They're on their computers with deeply enriched blue light, right? And so there are hacks around this, but it just shows how we are defying so much of our synchronization with nature and how important that is, right? We do need darkness. And one of the naturopathic doctors on our medical team a few years ago was talking about darkness deficiency, how we don't have enough darkness. Like if we look at circadian nutrients, I call them circadian nutrients, melatonin and vitamin D, which we're going to get into. We want the balance. It's good to have light, and I think people get that sunlight is really important, and that message has been driven home. We heard a lot about that, but what we didn't get on the other side of that is that darkness is also equally important. And it's what most people are thinking it's, lesser important. That's where electricity has come into enhancing productivity, people disrupting their sleep, and not being synchronized with their clock. All of that translates, I'm setting the stage here to show, where does the dysfunction come in? In the scientific literature, you actually see that there is this term, circadian syndrome. You may have heard of metabolic syndrome, which is more or less like looking at elevations in blood pressure, changes in lipids, changes in body composition. But now you've got circadian syndrome, which is all of those things. But now you've got mood issues, sleep issues, cognitive issues. And this translates into what is now being birthed as chronobiological disease. For many years in functional medicine, we talk about lifestyle-induced diseases. So if you don't sleep right, eat right, live right, you kind of start to, maybe you smoke or you eat a lot of processed foods. Eventually, you start to see that there's a disease. But now we see that time and light and darkness are entering into this picture, and we're starting to see not just lifestyle-induced diseases, but chronobiological disease for a variety of reasons. This is like a long, twisted chart of all of that, but it's just to show that, let's just focus at the top here. We're not going to go through this. This is overwhelming, but it shows that there is this interconnection between the signals that we are sending to the body through light and darkness and stress and sleep, and that's funneling all into circadian disruption, which then can lead into ultimately setting the stage for dysfunction in the body. So shift work can be problematic. Artificial light at night, sleep disruption, which you can see in the perimenopausal period, psychosocial stress, mistimed eating, when people are they don't have consistency. Consistency is really important for wake time, bedtime, eating time. That is synchronizing the clocks. So I like to show this clock here, and this is not something that I created. I actually took it from this article. I just recreated the image here. But basically what we're seeing here is that there's a time to do certain things, right? And there are times when hormones are going to be most active. So it's just a nice thing to revisit because it may start to reframe our everyday. So if we think about, let's just keep it just to melatonin. Melatonin is peaking between 2 and 4 a.m. Okay. And then as we start to wake up, now melatonin hands the baton over to cortisol. Now we start to wake up, our blood pressure starts to go up. Melatonin shuts off because now cortisol has the stage. And then we kind of move through the day. So, again, the blue, the top, the darkness piece is when we start to see the secretion of melatonin. The light is more driven through cortisol. There is more and more literature on this. Maybe you have me back to talk about chrononutrition because that's like a whole other conversation and it's vast. But in terms of like what to eat and times to eat and how do we regulate all of that, it's just the I think in my study, so I have a master's and a doctorate in medical science and human nutrition, and I don't think I've ever had so much information about chrononutrition, like the when of eating. It was just always the what of eating and the amount of eating. So it was like, okay, your macros, your micros, your phytos, and grams, calories, but never that you could take a healthy meal and eat it at the wrong time of day and have an untoward effect, right? Even when you think you're eating well. But anyway, that's a larger conversation.
Can we go really general on that and talk about when ideal eating time would be and when the cutoff would be, just to support the body, really high level?
Really high level is eat when it's light. Don't eat when it's dark. That's if anybody stopped me in an elevator and just said 30 seconds, just tell me what time to eat. Eat breakfast, eat when it's light, eat about an hour after waking, and then as you go through the day, try to keep your eating window to like 9 to 10 hours. But as it starts to get dim, you want to eat very, very little. And I know that that's going to change seasonally, but as it gets dim and you start to produce more melatonin, melatonin doesn't work well with insulin. So if you're having more carbohydrate at night, like you have this big pasta meal at like 8 p.m., now it's like insulin and melatonin are going to war. Are we going to digest or are we going to sleep? So long story short, eat when it's light, eat when it's bright. This is ancient wisdom. This is like nothing even new. It's just that science is catching up with a lot of like whether Ayurveda or also traditional Chinese medicine, which also talks about like the balance of like what time you would eat. But eat when it's light. Don't eat as much when it's dark. That's the takeaway.
You quickly mentioned the fact we want to wait 1 hour after waking to eat. Why is that?
Just to kind of wake up and get the digestive system in gear. If you think about, if you're sleeping 7 to 9 hours, you wake up potentially dehydrated. So like when you don't have proper hydration, thirst and hunger can kind of get those signals can kind of get mixed up. So I think that, and this is from talking with Dr. Sachin Panda, who wrote the book, The Circadian Code, and just talking with a number of different people about that, I think allowing for hydration to happen for that first hour. I mean, I do that now. Like I'm very loyal with, waking up, moving around, getting my circulation going, because it's like it's turning on all the digestive apparatus, so to speak, in order to help you properly digest. If you just wake up kind of bleary-eyed and you just start eating, it's like, not everything is in sync yet. Give yourself, and also it's really important to make sure that that melatonin signal has been properly turned off. So going outside for a few minutes to allow the eyes to see bright light. You don't look at the sun, you just make sure that you're getting exposure to bright light, or even if it's cloudy outside, that's still carrying a lot of the different wavelengths in order to start to shut off melatonin. Now you, again, put melatonin away so that cortisol can come out. Cortisol is a highly metabolic hormone that's going to help you process the breakfast. But if you're just kind of groggy and you're still sleepy, you could still have some melatonin hanging around. So again, that's why you want to allow for about an hour. Get the first morning light through the eyes. Let yourself wake up. Get hydrated. Just get your body in gear so you can properly digest.
Okay. First hour, light, hydration. When it comes to dosage of light, if somebody's going to go outside, how long do they need?
About 5 to 15 minutes. I mean, ideally, a little bit longer. I think, 15 to 30 minutes would be great, but you actually don't need a whole lot. It depends on how light your eyes are. So I think you have brown eyes, if I'm seeing,
I do.
okay. So you might need a little bit more because you have a deeper hue of your iris. Like the color of the eye makes a difference too. So I have really light green eyes. So for me, I just, 5 to 7 minutes. It's not going to take me long to get that signal of light because my eyes are already sensitive. But for somebody like you with darker eyes, you might need a little bit longer. So you might need the 15 to 20. Just go
Okay.
and walk around, just get the body moving at the same time you're getting that light if you can.
And this is helping with that hormonal switch, going from
Correct.
the melatonin to the cortisol.
Yep. It's like using light as a signal. It's like the obvious and it's available to all of us, but seasonally we're going to have some changes there.
Okay. Continue.
All right, this is just showing the connection between melatonin being pronounced at the time of the day that would synchronize more to darkness, and then the glucocorticoids like cortisol they're going to be up during the daytime. That's why I say to eat during the light time because cortisol helps you with the metabolic response of a meal. Melatonin will not help you with that. It's not meant to. It's about rest and rejuvenation. It's not about metabolizing fuel. So you're going to give your body mixed messages if you do that. So I don't want to dwell too much here, but again, we did talk about the gut. This is where we do produce a lot of the non-pineal melatonin. It's been documented in every part of the gastrointestinal tract. So the GI tract actually has layers. And so you've got like the middle of it, which is the lumen. You've got the mucosa, like those cells around that are secreting things. Then you have the muscular layer that is responsible for peristalsis and the movement of the gut. You actually find melatonin in all of those compartments. And we also know that 60 to 70% of the immune system is found in the gut, right? And we know that there's a connection between melatonin and the immune system. So just tending to the gut is important for us talking about melatonin. This is just, I don't think we need to get into this too much. It's just kind of talking about how even things like fiber. So when we take in fiber and we start to break it down into short chain fatty acids like butyrate, some people might have heard of butyrate before. This can stimulate some of those gut cells to produce things like serotonin. And if we have serotonin, we can more easily get to melatonin. So it's just showing like tend to your gut for good, healthy gut levels of melatonin. This is an important slide. This is really important for people to understand. And it really ties into just our body's ability to produce melatonin naturally. So, as I mentioned, when we are first born, we produce very minimal melatonin. So, I would say up to like 3 months of age, we're relying on like our body's trying to catch up. And if we're, and keep in mind that you don't find melatonin in formula. So babies aren't getting it externally unless they are nursed or they're just going to come up to speed to start to produce it on their own. This is what I was referring to before, how maternal melatonin supplementation can help to shape the gut microbiome in the offspring. This was an animal study, really interesting in that way. So, melatonin is the highest. Now, we're talking from the pineal gland. So, when we look at the ability of the body to produce melatonin from the pineal gland to synchronize our circadian rhythm, it is peaking during childhood. Like kids, if we're talking like, 5 to 11, they would be at their maximum of melatonin. right? So when I see that, kids are being given melatonin gummies or melatonin supplements, it's like, wait a minute. I think we need to look at sleep hygiene. We need to get kids off of devices earlier. They need to have like screen protection. What are they doing at night? Just really being in obeyance with good practical sleep hygiene measures, right? Because I don't think children should be taking melatonin to help with sleep and to get them to sleep. And and it's so easy to overdo something like a gummy. And why would we want a child to have all that sugar right before bedtime? I don't think that's a good idea. So, what happens is that as the other hormones come on the scene, we start to see that melatonin starts to decline a bit through puberty, and that's normal. That's a normal process. But then as we go through life, we continue to decline in our pineal melatonin. So that by the time we get to our mid 50s, which is where I'm at, and even further into 60s and 70s, we start to see negligible amounts of melatonin produced by the pineal gland. I was on a different podcast with, I don't know if you know who Dr. Dickon Weatherby is, but as I'm explaining all of this, he said, "Wow, Deanna, this sounds like melatonopause." It's another pause. We think of menopause, andropause, adrenopause, right? All of these different pauses where hormones start to go down. Well, we see this with melatonin. What we also see, I don't show it here, but we start to see a rise of other types of conditions, right? It may not just be from lower melatonin, it could be from lower hormones in general. But I do think that melatonin is a key feature to longevity and helping with our aging process. And we're going to get into why.
Would that graph look the same for males and females?
Yes. Yes. For the most part, yes. There are some slightly different dynamics between men and women. Like, for example, women absorb melatonin better than men. Women tend to have an earlier chronotype than men. Like, women tend to be morning, whether sometimes we call those morning larks or but women tend to be more morning focused. There is a little bit of a difference in circadian rhythm and sleep patterns, but for the most part, if we're just looking at general curves of melatonin, yes, we would start to see this decline pretty similarly. So if we look at the 24-hour clock, what we see is, again, as I mentioned to you, negligible melatonin in the blood if it's daytime, but as it starts to get dim outside, again, dim light melatonin onset, we start to see that there's a curve. And as I was mentioning to you before, this is where some researchers start to measure melatonin in saliva samples just to see that curve going up. But truly, we wouldn't have the peak of melatonin until about 2 a.m. And then again, we want to turn off that signal by going outside to turn off, through the eyes, seeing bright, enriched light in order to then signal for cortisol to come up. And that'll help people with more, I would say, alertness in the morning too, if they were to do that consistently. So basically, we need both day and night for healthy levels of melatonin. So here's where we're going to get into a metric for everybody to be thinking about. So before electric lighting, humans were exposed to high intensity. So we're talking about a unit of light, which is called lux. And I'm going to explain that. So high intensity and dim light during the day and night, respectively. Like it was just our normal course where during the day we would have brightly enriched light. And then at nighttime, we would have candlelight, fireplaces, we would have a red hue, and it would be more dim. Well, we've kind of flip-flopped that, right? Because now we are indoors. We have less luminosity in offices and in workplaces. And, electric lighting is not like the full spectrum sunlight that we would want with all the different kinds of wavelengths, right? And at night, now we are staying awake and we're doing different activities. So we have flipped light on its head, I would say, and we have reversed that, which is causing a lot of that chrono disruption. Other reason I think it's so important to get that early morning light is because when you set the stage for cortisol to come in, remember how I said cortisol and melatonin work together? If you allow cortisol to come in the morning and do its thing, it actually will then prime melatonin signal at night. So again, they work together. But if you don't do that in the morning and, you kind of a jumbled up routine in the morning and you're not getting light and you're not eating regularly, no doubt you're going to have some issue with melatonin at night. Because it's like they're on a string, a biological string of like when you start to change one, it's a web. You're going to change the other. So having that early bright light can help with the signal of melatonin. So let's just talk really quickly about how do you measure light? So I want everybody to remember this. 1 lux, Lux, 1 lux is equal to a candle flame about 3 feet away, about 1 meter away. So that's pretty dim, right? 1 lux. Like the greater the lux, the more the luminosity, the brighter it is. And there is a way to measure lux through apps. So I have an app on my phone called Light Meter Lux. You can get any app. Mine is free. I just measure it and I just move the camera of my phone to wherever I'm looking, and it will give me a reading of the lux. So I am actually working in my home office in front of a light. Well, in front of a light, but then in back of the light, I have a window. And I actually moved around my house to see where would be a good place for me to work based on luminosity. Because again, even though I'm not able to be outside working, I need to prime my inside to be more like the outside during the day, right? So having even a window in front of me will help me to increase my lux. That will be more similar. It'll be similar, but not quite at the same intensity as being outside, but at least it's better than being by a wall where you have no luminosity coming in. So think about the bulbs that are in your home because, there are different kinds of bulbs. And if we have LED bulbs, which are cheaper, and yes, they can bring our electric bill down. But when we have that exposure at night, it can start to suppress melatonin pretty substantially. And it just depends on the color of your eye, how close you are to that light, the extent of the exposure. But there are some studies, and one study showed that 30 lux at night suppressed pineal melatonin by greater than 50%. So just think about that. This is just like not having enough darkness. Candlelight or red light, and some people have a filter on their computer or they wear the blue light blocking glasses, which can help to some extent. Like these that I have, these have been tested and these do filter blue light. Now, these are a little bit like reddish. There are orange blue light blocking glasses. There are light orange. I mean, you can get it for like every stage of the day. I wouldn't go through all of that trouble personally, but I do have for when I travel. And if I happen to be on the computer late at night, I'd want to put these on and reduce the dimness on my screen and even have a filter where it makes my screen more red. And there are different apps for that. You can do it on your phone as well. You can change the brightness, all kinds of hacks there. But I want you to really get this down because you got to get your light right. Right? You have to get that full spectrum light right during the day because that's going to change your hormones. It's going to change your sleep.
Okay. Can you give a bit more subjective idea of what that looks like? I think you mentioned 30 lux, decreasing melatonin by 50%. But how long does that exposure have to be? Somebody's not wearing their glasses. They go and open the fridge. Hopefully they're not eating at night. But they go buy an LED bulb, quickly or spend a few minutes there. Basically, what kind of stimulus is required to really bring that melatonin production down?
It can go quite quickly. It can happen within minutes. So you do want to be conscientious. And again, it's going to depend on the intensity of the light, the color of your eyes, also kind of like the level at which the eye is to the light. That's why like a night light down below, I really can't stand the refrigerator lights. Like you open it and it's We have one of those refrigerators where it's so bright, so bright. So if you were to go into the refrigerator at night, even for, 10 to 20 seconds, that could be inhibiting and suppressive to melatonin. So there are many different variables, but like a low light, um, that's why, just changing the bulbs in the home for, whatever lights you turn on at night, even if you can change the color of the bulb to make it red or orange or pink or use incandescent type of bulb, like kind of old fashioned, but quite honestly, it's almost like as we become more modern, sometimes some of those practices are detrimental. So, long story short, there is variability there, but it can happen quickly. And you'll know because after you would have exposure to that light, you might notice that you're a bit more alert, that, you might be a little bit less sleepy. This is why, like, if people wake up at night, it's not a good practice to be turning on any lights. It's better to stay in darkness and just try to rest and try to fall back asleep if possible.
Up until this point, we've been focused primarily on the eyes, but what about the skin? I've heard that light exposure to the skin at night can have some kind of negative impact. Any research on that?
I'm not sure about that. I think it would depend on the kind of light. And again, because the type of melatonin produced in the skin is just working systemically. It's not having that overall kind of body effect. So I think it's less important than the eyes. The eyes are just think of the eyes as signaling the brain. The skin is not signaling the brain in the same way. There could be some effect, but not nearly the same effect as the eyes. But I do think, we're doing more. What I see is being done is much more research on the gastrointestinal and the skin melatonin, and we're learning more. But right now, we know, I would say, the most about the pineal melatonin, just kind of stamping up all of the different domains.
So pineal is pretty protected if you're protecting the eyes.
Yes, think of the eyes, kind of like that diagram I showed you with, the eyes signaling suprachiasmatic nucleus, then signaling pineal. But yeah, it's the eyes are very specific for that. I do have light exposure recommendations. Basically, the takeaway here is you want a maximum of 1 lux at night, but you can have up to 10 lux if there needs to be activity. Um, it's just so important to measure the light in your environment, so in your sleeping room. So this is really key. So download some kind of app so that you can actually measure when it is dark. Is it truly dark enough? Or do you have a smoke alarm light? Do you have a night light? Do you have like other lights? I even look sometimes at kids who are like afraid of the dark. Then they have all of these lights on in their room trying to go to sleep. Um, Outdoor lights maybe shining into the room. So you may not have a setup where you are enabling your environment to be very dark. And in that case, what I would say is you may need to wear a sleep mask, to really block out the light if there's no other way to do it.
And if somebody is going to use a red light, like a red night light or a red light for reading at night, a red headlamp, can they get away with a higher lux?
Yeah. Yeah. The red light, what is most jarring and disturbing to the production of melatonin is the blue light. So yes, if we do more of the red light and you want to have more of that red light glow, that would be better, much better. Because really what we're looking at is the blue light. And when the eye is signaling blue light, it can't transmit the signal for the pineal gland to make melatonin. So that's a good distinction that you just asked about because it's not just luminosity, it's really very specific to blue light. This is an example of my app. I just took a screenshot of what I see when I use my Light Meter Lux app. So on the left, I'm in a hotel room here and I have a light on. I forget what time it was. It was either early morning or it was early or like later in the evening. But regardless, you can see that 778 lux. Now, again, if you're thinking like a bedroom with 1 lux or less, that little lamp there is generating a lot of spray, right? That's a high lux. And then I thought it would be instrumental to show you on a cloudy day how even if it's cloudy and I'm looking outside through a window, you're still getting a substantial amount of luminosity. And if I was outside, that would even be higher. So don't discount a cloudy day as being insignificant in terms of lux. Again, if you don't measure it, you don't know. This is why I love using the app because, just even in all different spaces, like if you travel and you're in a hotel room where, there are all these little lights on, like that's why you don't want to sleep with an LED alarm clock next to the bed because, you're going to have a spray. You don't want the phone next to the bed because of the potential spray. So being light conscious is so important for melatonin.
And you touched on this earlier. We can look at that from the other side too, where on a cloudy day, getting out in the morning is still advantageous
Yes.
because you're going to get the higher lux.
Correct. So I live in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, so lots of clouds here, and it's a challenge to get sunlight, right? But I have to go outside and still get that perception of even when it's overcast, that is important too. It is better to have sunlight. I'm not going to say it's not, but you can still get substantial lux through clouds.
Okay, quickly before you move on here, what do you think about hacking that with some of these indoor lights? For somebody in the middle of winter, they wake up, it's pitch black outside.
Yeah.
Is there ever a time and a place where you'd recommend those?
Yeah, absolutely. Those happy lights, sometimes you just have to do that. I mean, think of Alaska or Scandinavia where they have extended periods of darkness in the winter months. You need to work around that because otherwise there can be disruptions. I mean, already we think vitamin D, sleeping patterns are off, hormone patterns can be off. So yeah, I think in that case, you can apply light to be more in rhythm with the latitude at which you are living or visiting at. So yes. Yeah. In fact, I was talking with somebody because he was telling me how he always wakes up at 5:30 in the morning, no matter what time of year. But it's a little bit more difficult in the winter months, right? And he was asking about using like a happy light. And I said, absolutely. If you've got to keep that rhythm, I think the consistency is really good for the body. Not to say that, in the winter, I do think we need to allow for a little bit more time for rest, rejuvenation. There's a reason why we've got more darkness, right? But the body also likes consistency. So having that gentle signal to wake up through a full spectrum happy light kind of experience, I think is sometimes what you need to do. So yeah.
You also mentioned a couple of different apps for devices to modify the light. Which ones do you recommend?
Well, there's the app that I use to measure the light, but then in terms of the light that I have at home, we use the Philips Hue bulbs, which can be, you can basically regulate their luminosity through an app if you choose to do that. They are a bit more pricey. So for some people, just having a dimmer, like if they have a dimmer switch at home, that would be worthwhile, or just to substitute like a red bulb or just one that's incandescent instead of like a bright LED bulb. So yeah, there are just those that I'm aware of.
Are you aware of Iris? I use that on my computer. And then there's Night Shift for Mac devices.
Yes.
I have it on my phone, and then I use the Iris on the computer.
Yes, and there's also the FL.UX flux. So depending on the kind of computer you have, it can bring on kind of the reddish hue. So yeah, absolutely. That would be a good thing to bring in.
Great.
Because then you could work, a little bit more at night. I think even being more protective and doing the filters on your phone or computer, like native to the program, but then also like the blue light blocking glasses to double up.
Yeah, I think it's just important to be realistic. In the modern world, all of us would struggle to be perfect. So to have some of these hacks in place
Yeah.
to make it better than not.
Absolutely. You just do the best you can with what you have available. Like, I travel a lot, and so what I try to do is I don't do red-eye flights, ever. I will never do another red eye if I can avoid it. Because I mean, just think of the name of it, red eye. I mean, you are very much disrupting your sleep and your circadian rhythm, your melatonin, everything. Like, your next couple of days are gonna be so off. I like to fly early in the morning, because then you have, like, the full spectrum of light. I like to fly less in the evening hours. I try to fly earlier in the morning too because I don't want, like, the peak of solar radiation. That's a whole other conversation. But, there are certain hacks and certain choices that, if they're available to you, just choosing differently could be helpful. Back on this topic of artificial light at night. So, yeah, I teach on environmental health topics, and many times when we think of endocrine disruptors, we think of plastics, we think of parabens, phthalates, bisphenol A. Not many people think about light at night as an endocrine disruptor, but I do. It's not classically defined that way because it's not like a chemical that's, with a structure that's found in food, air, or water, but it is disrupting hormones. And it's one of those that I would say is very societally accepted, but it's changing the planet. It's changing ecosystems. When you see a lot of the photographs of the Earth at a distance, you can start to see like all of these light enriched areas. And in other areas of science, you start to see like changes in migration patterns and reproductive patterns of animals. Like, it's really changing us. So even if everybody just walks away from listening to this in the way of just saying, like, you know what, just got to get your light right, you need to make sure that you've got enough darkness. Like, we have become so distorted just in that. It'll help with hormones, right? It'll help with so many different things. Since I'm always monitoring the science, this was an interesting study looking at natural daylight during office hours improves glucose control and whole body substrate metabolism. Just a really neat study about, again, showing how positioning of your office light can not only be changing, but what I've been talking about, cortisol, melatonin, but how does that translate? It translates even into glucose control, right? So never underestimate the impact, the ripple through effect of changing these hormones and what ultimately it can be changing. I'm not gonna go through all of these study details. You can find them online or just look at that. Eye color, I've already mentioned. So people with light colored eyes are gonna be more susceptible to the suppressive effects of blue light at night compared to people with dark colored eyes. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't need to take precaution, but just like I need less light in the morning and you need more, I will be more susceptible to that blue light at night because of the sensitivity of my eyes compared with yours. But again, it doesn't mean that we are not going to respond. We just need to work that into the equation. So I already mentioned about darkness deficiency. The paper that we wrote was looking at vitamin D as like the sunlight vitamin, hormone, biological light sensor, and melatonin as kind of the counterpart to vitamin D in the way of looking at it as a dark sensor. I'm not going to go through this because this is in the paper and just shows a side-by-side comparison between vitamin D and melatonin. So I do think that they're somewhat related. They're kind of like brother and sister biochemically. They seem to be produced in similar parts of the body. The biggest difference is what makes them. So vitamin D needs ultraviolet light, especially ultraviolet B light, and melatonin needs darkness, but they do work hand in hand. This was a study looking at the connection between vitamin D, melatonin, magnesium, and basically it showed, and again, this is one study, kind of small, but it showed that women who were vitamin D deficient or insufficient, many of them had some issues with sleep, and if they had higher melatonin levels, there was an association with reduced risk for vitamin D deficiency. That doesn't mean that if you just correct your vitamin D levels that you will change your melatonin levels automatically, but there can be an interrelationship there. So that's again what that article we wrote was establishing. So again, it may just be a marker for proper sunlight, which means that we could be informing melatonin at night. All right, here's where we're going to get into the functions of melatonin. And I'm going to kind of whip through these, I would say, quicker, just so everybody gets a sense. I would say think of melatonin as the Swiss Army knife of functions, right? It's a multitasker. And so there are 6 main functions that I see for melatonin. One of them I've already been talking about. It's number 5, the circadian rhythm. The one I want to focus on with your audience, Jesse, is number 3. I want to get into the brain effects a little bit more. I don't really want to get into the viral replication. That's very complicated cell biology. The mitochondrial stuff is out there. It's an antioxidant, it's anti-inflammatory, but I do want to talk about the emerging work on brain. This is a pretty texty slide, but basically, it really speaks to melatonin being a very unique antioxidant. I don't think many people think of melatonin as an antioxidant, but there's been some elegant science to suggest that just one molecule of melatonin and its metabolites can scavenge up to 10 free radicals, so 1 to 10, whereas something like vitamin C can scavenge between 1 to 2 particles. So it's pretty powerful. So why is this important? It's important because it speaks to the repair and the protection of the cell. So I think that that's something for us to think about, right? Because this ties into aging and longevity conversations. This was a really interesting study where they took men and women, right? So men and women are shown here at different time points. So 2 a.m., 8 a.m., 2 p.m., 8 p.m., and basically showed that at this 2 a.m. time point relative to the other time points, you see increases, as we would anticipate, in melatonin, but then also in superoxide dismutase, catalase, glutathione reductase, and glutathione. It's like there is this army of cellular protection that emerges at night when we're sleeping. Because how are we going to actually repair and rejuvenate when we're active during the day, right? We have to like mobilize and catalyze and break down. We are in the process of being active, but nighttime is repair time. So that's another reason why we have to be thinking of melatonin in that respect. We also know it's anti-inflammatory, which is why it came up in conversations about the cytokine storm. Now, here's where I want to talk a little bit more about its connection to the brain. These are emerging conversations. So, not a slam dunk. We do need more clinicals, but already we're starting to see the scientific breadcrumbs being laid of melatonin being important in the brain as a neurotropic or a neuroprotective factor. And I'm going to tell you what that means exactly. There are studies where they're looking at cells, they're looking at animals, showing a variety of different effects on the nerve cells, showing better neuroplasticity, showing anti-inflammatory properties in the brain, also just showing how, there's this whole concept of neuroplasticity, right? Helping with the communication between nerve cells. And it seems like there are some characteristics of melatonin that may confer that property, or at least we're starting to see that stack up in the cell models. I'm going to skip this whole aspect on viral replication. It's pretty complex, but just know that there's an immune aspect related to its ability to break up viral replication inside the cell. The circadian rhythm, which we've already talked about, and the mitochondrial regulation, which seems to be important because the mitochondria is really active in cellular respiration and creating a lot of free radicals, right? So you would want to have the protection of melatonin. So there is some evidence too that melatonin supplementation may be able to help with a lot of the metabolic dysfunction that can happen caused by chronodisruption, which is why groups like people that do shift work or other people with maybe constrained day-night rhythms, like whether they're spending a lot of time in darkness, like people that work in radiology or in mines where it's more darkness versus light during the day. So there may be a way to help with kind of overriding some of these perturbations with melatonin. I mentioned that melatonin also plays a role in female reproductive health. We have receptors for melatonin on the ovary, on the uterus, even on the breast and the placenta. So that just shows, like, again, how important melatonin can be to a woman's life cycle and also to preconception and conception. I do want to mention that there is some emerging work on bone health. This is kind of interesting. There has been some clinical work looking at melatonin supplementation, so 3 milligrams per night to help improve bone turnover markers in perimenopausal women. And it seems like melatonin may help bone by promoting the osteoblasts and suppressing the bone breakdown cells known as osteoclasts. So I'm just putting that out there just to kind of make people aware of all of these many functions. But let's go into the brain. I just wanted to kind of toss through like some of the many functions. So like now if we think of your question, Jesse, in the beginning of like, okay, I know of melatonin as a sleep hormone. We can see it does a lot of other things. Again, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, chronobiotic. It's keeping us in circadian rhythm. It's a mitochondrial regulator, and it may actually play a role in brain in ways that we're now just learning about. Around the brain, we have a separate system that allows us to get rid of waste. This is called the glymphatic system. Think of it as the lymphatic system around glial cells. So it's like the brain detoxifies at night, and it's most active when we're sleeping, especially in our deep sleep state. And so this is really important, right? Because this is the way that we get a lot of things out of the brain, like beta amyloid, all of those accumulated tau proteins. I mean, the brain is just like any other organ, right? Like many people don't think that the brain gets sick or that it, becomes imbalanced in the same way as like the liver or the gut or the heart. But the brain needs to clear itself. This is like one of my favorite diagrams. Like you can see here how, again, the eye is an extension of the brain. And the eye is also clearing itself, right? Through this kind of drainage that occurs, especially with sleep. And eventually, we're clearing the brain at night, and then it's all funneling into the lymphatic system for clearance. I'll get to melatonin in a second. So you can see here, this is just the fluid flow. You have, again, there's the removal of the waste. And what happens is that the interstitial space starts to change, right? So that we can have a better flux and fluid flow of the movement of a lot of this waste out of the brain. So whenever we're sleeping, there's a 60% increase in that interstitial space. So essentially, like the brain cells shrink and the space around them expands so that we can clear things out through the cerebral spinal fluid and the interstitial fluid. So this is important, and we're learning about, in fact, just this morning I was reading, there are 3 new articles that were just published on the glymphatic system, looking at conditions that relate to neurodegeneration, dementia, and it just seems like it's going to be one of those things that we're all going to be assessing in some way how well we clear our brain at night. It has been related to brain energy, different neurodegenerative diseases, cognitive function. As I mentioned, the eye is also active in that process. So many people are getting eye issues, right? And so the eyes need that restoration as well. The nose also has a glymphatic system. You can kind of think anything in the head is participating in this drainage, getting rid of stuff. So the nose has it. There's even a question, is the ear also participating in this? So whenever we have problems here where we can't get things out, there is a buildup of toxins, And this can lead to an immune kind of response and an inflammatory kind of response as well. Here's a short list of some of the clinical implications of where there could be a dysfunction with lymphatic fluid. So if you just look at this quickly, you see like ADHD, autoimmune, brain issues, cardiovascular, dementia, insomnia, migraines, even mood disorders. So a lot of overlap here as we think about melatonin. And as we get older, we become less efficient in doing this. This is primarily derived from studies in animals where they measure the lymphatic fluid flux and they find that it's not as good as when they were younger. So you can see this, and this was actually done in adults. You see interstitial fluid flow decreases with age, especially after 50. So what else is decreasing after 50, right? If you remember melatonopause, you can see where I'm going with this. There's also a question about whether or not menopause is setting the stage for some changes with lymphatic clearance. I think that, as you can see the question marks, this is still being explored. The microbiota may also be changing up lymphatic activity. It's like, the body is so connected in so many different ways. But again, the gut microbiome has its own circadian rhythm, and it's all kind of woven into this web. So this is just one more recent study where it was looking at how when you have gut overgrowth, this may lead to changes in lymphatic clearance, believe it or not. And this really speaks to the gut-brain axis. And it goes back to what we were talking about very early on about how we need to tend to our gut in order to tend to our melatonin, to our neurotransmitters, and even to something like lymphatic clearance potentially. So what's really interesting about melatonin and how it comes into this conversation is that we're starting to see some research that would suggest that it plays a role in the excretion of brain waste. Now, we don't have good clinical data on this. That's still premature. But what we start to see in the literature is some research that would suggest through supposition based on its mechanism and also in animal studies that there could be some aspect of melatonin that's used for that lymphatic fluid flow. This was a study in mice showing how melatonin regulates lymphatic function. This was a great article looking at melatonin in helping to modulate beta amyloid. So lots of different factors can change lymphatic activity. It's not just, us thinking about melatonin, but that's our entry point into the conversation. There can be many different things that are being explored for enhancing lymphatic activity. But the thing with melatonin that I think is interesting is that because it connects to the mitochondria, there might be this connection between melatonin, the mitochondria, and the lymphatic system. So I think that this is still premature. I think that a lot of this is still being talked out in the scientific literature. But it does make sense because neurodegenerative conditions are diseases that connect into changes in metabolism or energy production. And we know that melatonin is, as I mentioned, very connected to the mitochondria. The mitochondria can actually produce melatonin, but it can also, the mitochondrion can take it up as well. Let me just address this in the section on the mitochondria here because you were asking about this. So if we think of the actual overall body pool of melatonin, the near infrared radiation that we might have through the skin could cause some production of melatonin as we were talking about in the skin. But again, it doesn't seem to be used for the same reasons for which the pineal melatonin is used. Some people say, well, can't I just eat more tart cherries? Tart cherries, don't they have melatonin? And, so as part of the paper, and being that my background is in nutrition, I wanted to understand this a little bit more. So this table that I have posted here is from the paper that we wrote. What you tend to find is that, yes, melatonin is in plants. It is ubiquitous in the animal and the plant kingdom, and it's especially in the nut and seed portions, so the reproductive portions of fruits, and vegetables, so plant foods. So that's why you hear about things like pistachios or different seeds containing melatonin. The only thing though is that if you actually do the calculation and you try to figure out, okay, how many tart cherries do I have to have before bedtime to just give me a basic dose of melatonin that my body would just be making naturally. When you do the calculation, first of all, there are a lot of different like variable aspects to consider because not all cherries produce the same amount of melatonin. It's dependent on the environment, right? But in general, when I took a range of the amount of melatonin found in cherries, I'm just using cherries as an example, but you have a number of different ones here. What you see is it would take 2,718 fresh cherries in order just to get zero point 0.3 milligrams of melatonin. So again, it's not really feasible. If we look at pistachios, that's another main one, and there's been a lot of debate about the research on pistachios, but it looks like over 1,500 raw pistachios. So I'm not saying don't eat these foods. I think that these foods are excellent, and in fact, cherries are great sources of polyphenols, which could also be chronobiotic agents, but in a different way. And they're also anti-inflammatory, which could be helping with sleep. So, by all means, have your tart cherries, but don't have so many of them at night because that'll disrupt your sleep. So when we're thinking about food and melatonin, remember what I said initially, that melatonin, the precursor is tryptophan. So what do we need? We need protein, right? Protein is important for this conversation because protein will actually be the precursor, provide the tryptophan, hopefully, that we need in order to then later convert into melatonin. But just note, you can see all these pathways here, that it's not just a quick conversion. Enzymes require nutrients, and if we have genetic variability in those enzymes, maybe they won't be as efficient. So not everybody's going to produce the same amount of melatonin from a single quantified dose of tryptophan. So we need the tryptophan. I don't want that message to get lost. We do need protein that will give us tryptophan, but we also need to ensure the proper conversion into melatonin. So I think this is an important slide for people to see. So again, tryptophan is in the brain. It's going to convert into 5-HTP, convert into serotonin, convert into N-acetylserotonin, convert into melatonin. This is why in some cases it makes sense to be thinking about a melatonin supplement because these are a lot of steps. And already as we go through life, our melatonin production is less. So if we want to be thinking about things like the lymphatic fluid flux, antioxidant activity, anti-inflammatory activity, mitochondrial regulation, this is where thinking about supplements seems to be warranted, right? I've been in the supplement industry for most of my professional life. So over 20 years, I've been in the supplement industry in a variety of formats. And it's a spectrum. You can have, you have to look at the science, the safety, the quality. And I don't think all supplements are needed. There are certain things people take, and I'm wondering, why are you taking that? But our food isn't perfect, even when we are doing the best we can. It's just that, when I talk to all of these melatonin researchers, one of them even made a comment like melatonin should be in the drinking water. It is so essential to our survival. If you read Dr. I'm just seeing, I don't have it here. I have it in my library, but Dr. Russell Ryder has a great book, and it's just called Melatonin. It was written in 1995. It was published in 1995. It's a consumer book. So good. And he gives all of the studies. And one of them he quotes was an animal study in which they actually did put melatonin in the drinking water. And they followed, I think it was mice, not rats, but mice. And they followed them over time. And they found that the mice that had the melatonin in the drinking water aged 20% less. And I hope I have that number correctly. I believe it was 20% less than the other group. I'm not saying to put melatonin in our drinking water. All I'm saying is that there's something here for us to consider. And again, I'm not just, you know, looking at negating diet. Our diet is important. Our stress is important. How we sleep is important. Our light exposure is important. But after I started doing all this melatonin research, I called family members. I'm like, you need to get on melatonin. My mother was already taking melatonin. So, like, she's always ahead of the curve. But I was like, I became like the biggest beacon of like telling everybody about this because I was just like, I just can't believe it because it's like you see it in the media as a bad thing. And I think it's because people just don't understand it. They don't understand the complexity of it. And for the people that do understand it, when they think like, "Oh, it's so good, let's just do more." And then people are taking like double digit, triple digit amounts. And I'm like, "Wait a minute, don't we just want to like smooth the gap? Like truly think as a supplement, right? So like a physiologic level rather than a pharmacological level." That's kind of my premise. But there are many different oral routes to take melatonin. I know I mentioned chewables and gummies. I'm just not a gummy fan overall because I remember I had a client many years ago. She had a specific health condition, and so she couldn't eat a lot of foods. And as I was doing an intake on her, I realized like she was just like overdoing gummies because she was thinking she had to get nutrients. So she wasn't eating a lot and she needed to get the gummies. The gummies were like the best way she could get it in. And I was started to tabulate how much sugar she was getting from these gummies. And it equated to like 7 teaspoons of sugar. But that was because she was taking a large amount of gummies, right? So there's that. But I think with gummies, we overdo things. There's a potential for overdose. There are other things in the gummy. Is the melatonin really stable in that matrix? So anyway, I know that for people who take a lot of supplements, there's pill fatigue. I honor that. I know that. And I know that that's why chewables have come into the picture because people are just tired of slicking down another tablet or a capsule. But I do think that there are certain things for which it is warranted. The typical dosing of melatonin is about 40 to 60 minutes before bedtime. That's like if you were to take the box and read the label, that's pretty much what you're going to see. Take an hour before bedtime. There's a little bit of personalization there, right? Because when we talk about a dose, a biological, physiologic dose of zero point 0.3 milligrams, which kind of smooths the gap of what we're losing over time, I do think that for some people, they need to maybe take it maybe 2 hours before bedtime, especially if they're the kind of person that gets groggy in the morning from melatonin, because they may just take longer to metabolize it. So there can be some nuance with the dosing of it. But I do think that having zero point 0.3 milligrams to kind of fill the gap, and then a higher dose of 3 milligrams, like this would be good for jet lag. This would be good for, I showed you the bone study where they did use 3 milligrams. I think that's like the sweet spot, you know, between zero point 0.3, which you will see with many different opinion leader organizations and studies, up to about, like 6 milligrams. But when we start to get into the double digits, like 10 and on up, there is much less science for a lot of that.
Okay, let's really stick here with dosages and how somebody can go about taking this. You mentioned, I think it was 40 to 60 minutes before bed typically. It sounds like the dose is 0 0.3 milligrams to a milligram.
Yep.
I've come across research showing that orally isn't the best way to take melatonin, and the absorption is actually really poor. Have you seen that, and how do you think about that?
Well, that's what's been studied in the trials is oral intake, supplementation. So, and I think what you want is kind of this biological or kind of a slow release of it, if possible. So the herbatonin that I'm going to talk about, which is from Symphony Natural Health, is in a plant matrix. So it's not like the isolated melatonin, like the white powder. It's actually within the plant matrix. So it's almost like it just has properties of what we would see as slow release, right? Because it's bound up in a matrix. But that is when you look at the studies, that's what we're looking at is oral supplementation, not what are you thinking of in terms of application of melatonin?
Well, there's a company called Mitozen, and they do suppositories, and I think their highest dose is 400 milligrams. So absorption is supposedly a lot better that way, and the dosage is obviously a lot higher. So I want to make sure we cover the full continuum,
Yeah.
0.3 milligrams, all the way to this super dose, 400 milligrams suppository.
I have not seen any data on suppository melatonin as a supplement and also at that level of 400 milligrams. That's a very, very high dose. And, I just don't know the kinetics. I have not seen any data on it. I'm curious about it because I've actually talked with somebody who was taking that and I was thinking, wow, that's very interesting in terms of a thought process, but again, not really knowing like the data and seeing that. And is that safe?
You
I don't
quickly
know.
touched on the fact that different people
Yeah,
are going to respond differently to taking melatonin. And I've heard you talk about people that metabolize caffeine either fast or slow. It's actually related to this and how they metabolize melatonin.
correct. Thank you for bringing that up. So that's part of my message about taking the time that you take melatonin before bed. So somebody who is a quick metabolizer of caffeine, like you have some people, myself included, or I could do an espresso before bedtime and go right to sleep. No problem. I'm a fast metabolizer of caffeine. I'm a person where I need to take my melatonin just right before bedtime because the same enzyme that metabolizes caffeine does, just like you said, metabolize melatonin. But that also means that if you're a heavy coffee drinker, you're going to be competing with that enzyme with melatonin, right? So you can start to change the kinetics of melatonin potentially. So even if you can drink coffee into the night, this can now change your melatonin metabolism as well. It may start to interfere. So keep that in mind. And everybody's kinetics on that will be a little bit different. But let's just take another person, my husband. Like he cannot have coffee after like 12 noon. Forget about it because then he won't be able to sleep. He needs to take melatonin 3 hours before bed in order to metabolize it. And we kind of experimented with him to figure out like what was, and I said, well, let's first do 1 hour. Then, he was still groggy, 2 hours. And this is taking the herbatonin zero point 0.3, right? We kind of had to continue to back it on out until he was feeling like, okay, he's done with the metabolism of it. Because eventually it metabolizes on out of the system. That's what you want. So how about for you? Are you a fast metabolizer of caffeine or are you a slow?
I'm like you. My wife is like your husband. So, yeah.
Right. So for us, we need it right before bedtime, and I take certain supplements right before bedtime because those are the things to take, before bedtime. So I'm taking my herbatonin along with those things. If you want to slow the release even more, taking it with a little bit of fat will help to slow, gastric emptying of melatonin. But yeah, I mean, again, I think it's about like just helping the body to see the signal. And I'm basing these doses and even the route of supplementation based on the research. So it's not to say like there aren't all these different groups out there doing different things. One thing I have had questions about is, Deanna, what about the extended release melatonin formats? And if you look at some of those extended release formats of melatonin, what I don't love about them is that many times they contain phthalates or some agent that is not particularly something that I'd want to be taking in order to kind of drag out that absorptive curve, which is why, again, having the plant matrix makes for a nice composite in that way. But
Got it.
let me answer this question. Maybe since you've listened to me before, I have answered this question, but maybe for some people listening in this audience, they're wondering, if I start taking melatonin, is this going to change my body's production of it? And I have wondered about that as well, because where does this thought even come from? Where does this question arise from? It arises from, if we look at things like testosterone therapy or taking other kinds of hormones and how that can change our own dynamic and our feedback loops through the endocrine axis, right? Well, with melatonin, and there have been some studies that actually set out to answer that question. And I've also asked a lot of the melatonin experts like Dr. Ryder, Dr. Tan, others, have they ever seen this, or is this a phenomenon that we should be aware of? And the answer, at least at this point of the data and what we have available, is that we don't see that reduction in production if you are taking melatonin. Now, if you're taking it in a different format at a very high dose, I don't know about that. I'm speaking to the levels that have been just tested in clinical trials. And in some of those cases, even Dr. Paolo Lassoni, who is an oncologist in Italy, who I've actually interviewed, he was a real groundbreaker in the way of using supplemental melatonin in his patients with cancer as they were undergoing chemotherapy, because he found that the melatonin helped the chemotherapy to target the cancer cells and to keep the healthy cells healthy. And you can look at his research on that, Dr. Paolo Lassoni. I mean, that research is from like the 1990s. It's not like new research. But again, he used that more short term, higher dose. It wasn't like an extension of like a high dose over a longer term. So, yeah, we don't, or at least at this point, at this juncture, at least from what I am aware of, we don't tend to see that. The bioavailability piece that you spoke of is true, that we don't, if you just look at the bioavailability of melatonin after administration of melatonin, there is this study from 2000. But again, how much do we need and at what time to like see the signal, right? If we're just looking at what the pineal produces and supplementing that a bit, then perhaps that's all we need. And also, that's what we see in the studies to help with things like parameters that relate to sleep. One thing I think people should be aware of is that as I started to get into the melatonin supplements and look at them for the synthetically derived melatonin, which is 99% of the supplements that are out there, right? Like 1% is plant based. But when you look at like back when melatonin became a thing, after 1958, when there was kind of like this traction and like interest in the pineal gland and in melatonin, it was that melatonin was extracted from the pineal gland of animals, but that's not really feasible. The pineal gland's really small. Just knowing what you know about melatonin, you'd have to get the melatonin at a certain time of production. Then you've got all of the issues with infections and just it's not ethical, right? There's just a lot of different issues, and it's expensive to do that. So what ended up happening is that there were a lot of different patents that had started to come out. Even Dr. Wortman at MIT had created a patent around the dose of melatonin, right? Which led to many people creating melatonin supplements greater than 1 milligram, because the patent was up to a milligram, I believe. So what you find is that a lot of the patents were around a chemical process to make melatonin, but a lot of the starter compounds were petrochemical derived, so like coal petroleum ether. And in that multi-step process, you would get different derivatives that would form. So if your audience is taking a melatonin, you want to know where it's coming from. You want to know what is the source of that. What is, has it been tested for contaminants? Because there are at least 2 different review articles, and you can see them here. I have them at the bottom of the slide, in which these authors did look more into the different contaminants that can be in synthetically derived melatonin. So you can see here different tryptamine derivatives, serotonin, type of derivatives and such. So, anyway, it's just important to know the quality of the melatonin that people are taking if they're taking it.
Okay, important you went there. Piggybacking off of what you said a couple minutes ago, we're not downregulating our production of melatonin by taking it.
Correct.
But is there a safety concern? Somebody who hears what we're talking about today gets really excited about melatonin and starts taking it on a daily basis long term. Any safety concerns?
Yes. Because melatonin has all of these functions as an antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, it can change heart rate, it can interfere with metabolism of things like caffeine, which means that it can interfere with metabolism of certain pharmaceuticals. Yes, you want to check that out with your healthcare provider. If you are taking a very low dose, a biological, physiologic dose, that zero point 0.3, chances are that's pretty that'll be pretty amenable to most people. But when you start to do higher doses, that's really where you would need to check that out. But regardless, any supplement that you would be taking, even if it's fish oil, you should actually check that out with your doc because fish oil can change clotting. Many people are on different blood pressure drugs. You might lower your blood pressure with melatonin. So you might actually need less of certain medications. So you want to work with a provider who can match that gap effectively. So thank you for mentioning that. And also because it does have some immune stimulatory effects for people that have certain issues with like an autoimmune condition or certain aspects where they would not want a stimulation of their immune system, you need to be cautious with melatonin supplements. So another reason to check it out with your doc.
You quickly touched on morning grogginess. Somebody who has been avoiding taking it, worried about that. It sounded like just taking it earlier on in the day, while in the evening, would help, but any other guidance there?
Well, and also the dose, because what are they probably taking? Probably a 5 milligram or a 10 milligram, which is too much. So they are a person where they need less and yes, to back it on out so that you might have to, again, experiment with this a little bit, but the zero point 0.3 milligrams taken like 2 to 3 hours before bedtime, that might be something to start with. And just to go back to, I keep mentioning the herbatonin, but I didn't really define it or to show you the research on it. I'm first and foremost, I'm not vegan or vegetarian, but I am very much focused on plants because I feel like plants connect us to nature. Plants have their own intelligence in so many ways. And so when we look at herbatonin is derived from three different plants, three things that are essentially green. So from alfalfa, chlorella, and rice. So it not only has the melatonin that you naturally find in those plants, but also the accessory amino acids, even essential fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, and certain phytonutrients, even low levels of lutein and zeaxanthin, which are good for the eye. Now, those aren't going to be substantial amounts, but they are all, as I like to think about it, we honor the matrix of the plant and how the plant works in its natural environment rather than just do the human thing of taking one thing out and then like, let's just see how that works, right? No, this is like a composite. And you'll even see that the capsule, like the material inside, is green. So this publication that you see on the right, I'm not on this publication. This was a separate research group that took the herbatonin material versus synthetic melatonin and did a number of different tests. So I'll show you some of the results from those tests. This was where they looked at an enzyme called COX-2, cyclooxygenase 2, and they looked at its ability to inhibit COX-2. So if you could inhibit COX-2, that would be seen as anti-inflammatory. So the first bar here, the blue bar, is the herbatonin. The second bar is synthetic melatonin. So this is the same amount of melatonin in this cell model to look at COX-2. And what you see with the herbatonin is 646% greater anti-inflammatory activity. Again, same amount of melatonin, but the effect was greater. Now you could say, well, Deanna, is that because, again, the herbatonin contains all these things? We think it is because it does have the melatonin, but it has all of those other things working, as I would see it, holistically and together. The researchers also did another test looking at free radical scavenging, which would tell us something about the antioxidant properties of melatonin. So the first bar here is herbatonin. The other 3 bars here are synthetic melatonin. And similarly here, you see 470% greater free radical scavenging. So even though it's the same dose, it's more effective in doing the job it needs to do in the body, anti-inflammatory and also free radical scavenging. This was in a skin cell model. So you have 2 bars here. The first one is the herbatonin. The second one is the synthetic melatonin. And what you're looking for here is you're wanting the bar to be lower because that would show less reactive oxygen species. So you can see at different time points that far and away that the plant melatonin, the herbatonin, did better, 100% better than the synthetic melatonin. And then when the team had looked at, ORAC it stands for oxygen radical absorbance capacity. It's very simply like a crude measure of antioxidant activity, and it's looking at certain free radicals. What you see is that it is much more potent than you see for synthetic melatonin. And I just happened to put it here within this little table with foods and other things just to put it in perspective. This doesn't mean you shouldn't eat blueberries, but it was just kind of looking at like truly the potential from an ORAC value. Oh, one more thing I want to mention. With the herbatonin, it's packaged in a blister pack. So it is like on these foil sheets and each one is individually wrapped. That is really important. You all want to be thinking about the packaging of all of your supplements. So, if you have something that breaks down in heat, light, and oxygen, it needs to be protected in such a way so that by the time you're down to the last capsule in that box or in that jar, that the integrity is protected and that you get that dose. That's why in the supplement industry, they have to put in what's called overage. There's a certain percentage to enable the shelf life of the whatever the label claim is to be sustained over time. So with the herbatonin, it is individually, like in this blister pack sealed, so that you're just taking one out of the foil at a time. So it's not being exposed to the oxygen in the actual box, which I think is important. So think about that. When I see a lot of these big totes, these big bags of protein powder with a bunch of vitamins and minerals and even in my home, I must admit, I do have a vitamin C. And when my husband uses it, he never quite like closes the lid tight. And I'm like, by the time we get to the bottom of this, we're not going to have any vitamin C. Vitamin C oxidizes with air and, light. So, you want to be thinking about that, whether it's a fish oil. Now, certain other things are pretty stable, like minerals. Don't need to worry about those so much because they're pretty stable. Like magnesium, you don't have to worry about like all the blister packs but certain actives like in plants can readily oxidize. Like vitamin C can oxidize. Your omega-3s can go rancid. And melatonin, because it is an antioxidant, it can break down. So just keep that in mind. That's also why I don't think chewables and the gummies are so great because now you have it in this mixed matrix. And, what are the repercussions of that? Is there any changed activity of the melatonin as a result of being in that matrix? Has the company tested that? It's always worthwhile to ask the question.
Couple more questions as we wrap up.
Yeah.
One being, I've heard talk of people experiencing nightmares when they take melatonin. Have you seen this?
Yes, I've heard that. And that could be because the state of sleep that coincides with dreaming can be extended with melatonin. So we're kind of changing some of the sleep architecture, right? Because think again about when does melatonin peak? It peaks between 2 and 4 a.m., which can sync up with some people in terms of when they're in the more dream state of their sleep. So if you wear an aura ring or you're monitoring your sleep states, you might start to see, that it might change subtly. And so that can lead to changes in dreams. So yes, that could be the case. Do I see that as a negative? Um, I think for some people, let's just talk for a second, Jesse, about this 2 a.m. wake up and like what gets people to wake up because there is kind of that handoff there between melatonin, cortisol. There is this change in sleep architecture where we start to move into more of that higher dream state of sleep.
I
If
wanted to
people
go
have a
here, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Oh, okay. I'm preempting it because it kind of ties into your question, actually. I think this is where is it a good thing that melatonin can create more of our ability to dream? I think that we process a lot through sleep. Just like I talked about the glymphatic fluid and we're getting rid of waste, I think we get rid of psychological waste when we're sleeping, meaning that we process things from the day, we might problem solve. I don't know about you, but I have a very heightened dream state, like, and I can remember certain dreams, and it's like, what did that dream teach me, or what do I need to be aware of, or like, and sometimes they're not always pleasant. And I do think that this is the way that we can move some of that stuff through. Now, it might be too jarring for certain people. So, you'd have to work with a practitioner, just take that under advisement. But I think it is connected to kind of this tender period of 2 to 4 a.m. I think that if we are having disturbing dreams or we have issues with wake up at that time, we need to be looking at not really even melatonin, but cortisol. So when I think of cortisol, I think about nervous system regulation. I think of metabolism. Maybe some people are waking up between 2 and 4 because they are so heightened metabolically and from a cortisol perspective that their blood sugar starts to tank, right? Because what is the result of like, high cortisol and nervous system dysregulation? We might have issues with blood sugar balance. And so what could be waking us up is low blood sugar or changes in blood sugar. I actually had that personally. So as an experiment, I was wearing a continuous glucose monitor and I was wearing an Oura ring. And I was doing more extended fasting. So for me, it wasn't like a stress thing, but it was like, I was trying out all these things, right? That's just what we do. We like to experiment on ourselves. But I was doing an extended fasting starting at 3 p.m. And I woke up, I noticed I would continue to wake up between 2 and 3 a.m. And what I noticed on my CGM, which I wore for 2 weeks, was that my blood sugar would go down to 40 at night. And 40 is dangerously low. That is like, you don't want high blood sugar, but you don't want very low blood sugar. That's like, a threat to the body system. So for some people who have unstable blood sugar for various reasons, and this is why maybe not everybody should be overly fasting either, even though I talked about, having less during the nighttime when you're thinking about metabolism. For some people who are diabetic or have unstable blood sugar, they're shaky, they have just issues with their glycemic control, you do want to be attentive to that because that could be connected into that 2 to 4 a.m. window if you are waking up. But I see that as cortisol. I see it as nervous system dysregulation. I see it as blood sugar potential imbalance and instability. I also see it, this is a newer finding in the literature, it may be connected to increased toxin load, meaning that there is some work coming out showing how things like restless leg or a variety of different sleep disturbances are connected, associated with things like arsenic or increased endocrine disruptors, and starting to see that there is a connection there, which actually makes sense to me, knowing what I know about the brain expelling its waste in the middle of the night when we're sleeping, right? So if we have greater toxicity. Maybe we have more activity with all of this lymphatic fluid, and that's waking us up too. This pyramid, I don't often think in pyramids or triangles, especially with food. I think differently. But with this is kind of how I would put it all together. And this is in the paper that we wrote. So when it comes to like, what would be the first thing you do? It would be the first thing we talked about. Get your light right. Get your darkness right. Test your light and darkness in the rooms that you spend the most time in, whether it's your home office, your sleeping room, wherever you spend time. Just check it out with measure the lux, right? Back to that conversation. Up from that, try to reduce artificial blue light at night, whether all the things that you and I just talked about, right? Like put the screens on your phones, wear the blue light blocking glasses if you need to, change the bulbs out, use the dimmers if you have them, change out the bulbs into red or a more warming color. Even like small approaches to that. It's so interesting because, I have certain friends in the functional medicine space and I go to their homes and it's like I start to see like they're all doing the red light thing. Like now people are, they have the red bulbs in. And so like people are becoming much more aware. And it's an easy thing to do, quite honestly. And then from a diet perspective, we need to prime the body with the raw material that we need in order to make proper amounts of melatonin, right? Like my training is food first. Get the protein. Support the body in terms of its antioxidants. Like try to reduce overall inflammatory load, which just puts pressure on the brain and so many body systems and doesn't set the stage for proper sleep. And then when I'm thinking about specific foods, I'm thinking about a lot of the different foods that I spoke about, they may have low amounts of melatonin that are insignificant, but they could have other nutrients that are good. And so I think about different plant foods. I wrote this book called The Rainbow Diet, where I talk about each of the colors of foods and their functional signature. So think about the whole spectrum of different colors of foods and making sure that we get that entire spectrum. And then we dial it in with supplemental melatonin, like herbatonin, right? Like I would take this course with anything. I'm always like, even if we were having a menopause conversation, I would say, let's get nutrition, lifestyle right. We do everything we can. We do feminescence. We do other things to prime our body's endocrine system. We dial it in if we need it with HRT, right? The supplement, whatever the agent is, comes at the tippy top because then that is supporting everything else and everything underneath it is supporting its activity. So that's kind of how I see that all playing out. But let me know if I missed anything there.
No, that's perfect in wrapping up. Last thing I'll add to that, if somebody is going to add melatonin to what you just talked about there, they're brand new to it. We've, again, went really deep, shared a lot of detail, but distill it down for that person who's going to begin supplementing. What does that look like?
First of all, check it out with your doc. I think it's worth that conversation, especially if you're taking other medications, because again, it can help you. Those medications, whatever you're taking them for, your body might start working better where you might need less. So you would have to work with a practitioner and making sure that syncs up. I think having a physiologic dose of melatonin, the 0.3 milligrams, is a good place to start for most people. And using the basic directions of an hour before bedtime. I leave some of my supplements in my bathroom so that when I'm getting ready for bed, I am just doing it all at once. So without you trying to figure out all the caffeine and metabolism, just follow everything as such. Low dose, 0.3 milligrams, the herbatonin, taking that an hour before bedtime. Kind of just see how you do for the first week or so. I've had people text me and say, Deanna, like, I didn't think like such a low dose would make a difference, but I'm sleeping better. Like the goal is not always, you may not sleep better. That may not be what you see as the side effect of taking the melatonin. Because again, melatonin is more than a sleep hormone, right? You have to be thinking about the cortisol. You need to be thinking about the melatonin and the darkness and the light. So don't think of like taking the herbatonin is going to solve everything. You still have to do all of the different things in this triangle to really potentiate all of it working together. But I think just making it simple, Jesse, just what you said, like, 0.3 milligrams, you got to get the dose. The quality of the supplement is important. Taking it before bedtime, 40 to 60 minutes, and go from there. I think that's a really good way just to think about patching the gap of what we lose as it relates to aging. So I and we didn't really gosh, Jesse, there's so much more. Like there was, there are certain indications to go deeper into, right? And I even think about women's health, women going through menopause, wanting to sleep better, better bone health, all of that. You might need to tweak the dose a little bit depending on what your personalized needs are. You're asking me like, Deanna, make it simple, generic, all comers. What do we just say, like in general, before everybody kind of like personalizes it? So that's why I think you start low, go slow, and see how your body responds.
All right, Deanna, we're going to leave it there today. Wonderful conversation. We're going to link everything up in the show notes. Herbatonin, your books, social media, website. Again, really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving us the space to have this conversation. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching the episode. I got another great one lined up for you right here. Don't miss it. I'll see you over there.
I don't think that there's one better anti-aging, life-enhancing substance or biohacking thing that you could do than supplementing with melatonin. Sleep is just a little piece of melatonin. Melatonin is